Well, they say third time's the charm, Thomas. It might work this time. What do you think?
Look, I think this is just one of the many benefits of lockdown. We're having to figure out how to use all this wonderful technology.
So, welcome, listeners, to a slightly different episode of Staved Off. And I say slightly different because also welcome viewers, because this episode is available as a video. That's point of difference number one. Then number two is the fact that Thomas and I, somewhat extraordinarily, aren't in the same room. I mean, we do basically spend most of our days together.
Yes, this is far less conspiratorial than normal.
That's it. And of course, that's because Sydney is in a state of lockdown at the moment, and that's put things into a different state of play at the Cathedral, hasn't it, Thomas?
It does. It feels a little bit like the opening sequence of that television show Get Smart. The corridor seems to get longer and longer, and the number of doors that slam closed seems to increase. But anyway, the sun is shining. It's a beautiful day in Sydney, but unfortunately, yes, the doors of the Cathedral are very firmly closed, at least to general worshippers. It's not possible to have anybody at services at the moment, but they are continuing, and thanks to the magic of live streaming, we're able to bring Mass and now Vespers to everybody on the internet.
That's what we're going to be talking about today is Vespers. Now, I did mention that this is our third effort at this particular podcast. Let's hope that this time it works. And one of the things that we've developed in our efforts to get this going, Thomas, is the fact that I can no longer actually see you as I talk to you.
Well, lucky you. That's all for the better, I'm sure.
So why don't you tell me where you are, and you can explain to people who are watching this after the fact as well.
So I'm actually sitting in the choristers' vestry. In our subterranean choir rooms, there are a number of rooms. There's the main rehearsal room. There's a room just for the cathedral scholars. And this room is where the younger boys, the choristers, they really use it like a common room. But we do have rehearsals in here. There's a piano. It's where the probationers have their classes when the choristers are having rehearsals. So I thought I'd sit in here in order to be able to talk to you virtually.
Oh, well, it's an interesting experience for everyone, no doubt. And when was, in fact, the last time that you saw any of these choristers, Thomas? In person, at least?
It would have been just over 8 weeks ago.
Yes, it has been a while, hasn't it? But, we'll talk about this on a future episode, but things have been continuing with you doing online learning with them, as I understand it.
We are seeing them every day, or nearly every day, for Zoom choir. Yes, and I think we should actually talk about that, because although it's far from ideal, it nevertheless has got some virtues.
Right, and no doubt, as with all these things, there's a learning curve, and we can all get better in our skill set.
We can only improve, certainly.
Yeah, indeed. Anyway, so as we mentioned, what we're really going to be talking about today is the fact that from the Cathedral you're now streaming Vespers. Now that's every day of the week, is it, Thomas?
Yes, it is. And look, I'm actually really quite excited about this whole project, because I've been very gratified that for a number of years now the Cathedral Choir has been providing sung Vespers in the Cathedral almost every day of the week. I think it's a good thing, because really the Church tells us that the liturgy of the hours, evening and morning prayer, are of great importance, that really should be made possible for people to attend, certainly in major churches like St Mary's Cathedral. So I think we're doing part of our job there. But of course, most Catholics aren't actually very familiar with evening prayer, or Vespers as we call it. So I think we've got a bit of an education job to do, which is partly why I wanted to make this podcast.
Yeah, indeed. So now, first of all, I think probably the key thing to understand is that Vespers, while it's a liturgy and an opportunity for prayer, it isn't Mass, is it?
No, indeed. When I one of our Zoom classes with the choristers, we were actually getting them to sing through a Vespers, each boy doing a different portion as we went through. And I started by asking them, getting them to remind one another what Vespers is, because they do know, they have sung Vespers before. But the answer that kept coming back is, well, it's not Mass. And indeed, it's not Mass. It doesn't have the crucial component of Mass being Holy Communion. But in other ways, of course, it's not dissimilar in that it's an opportunity to prayer. It's structured prayer time. And it functions by way of moving through psalms, responsories, reading, and canticles.
So let's talk a little bit about that structure then. I think so that because, as you say, probably a good number of people, even quite committed Catholics, perhaps aren't so familiar with some of the structure of the office as Vespers forms part of. So how does it begin?
Well, we begin with, funnily enough, the introduction.
Appropriate.
Which is a little formula that gets repeated at morning prayer as well. We make the sign of the cross together and pray an opening sentence, O God, come to our aid. O Lord, make haste to help us. And then we get Glory be to the Father. Now, this Trinitarian doxology, glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, comes back. It bookends almost every little section of the office. So we'll talk a bit more about that.
No doubt, yes. I think that the statisticians might want to count up the number of times that doxological formula comes throughout a whole day's office, but it would be many.
It would be, but it's a pretty good sort of formula for praise, isn't it?
No, indeed, absolutely. But after the introduction, there comes a hymn. Now, is that that's not really like all the hymns that we generally sing at Mass, though, is it?
Not really. The office hymn at Vespers is a much older and really a more integral part of the service. Hymns actually belong properly to the office. We talk about singing hymns at Mass, but actually really the Missal, the book that explains how Mass is to be celebrated, really doesn't envisage the singing of any hymns.
Right.
There are slightly different types of chants that are expected at Mass, and again, that's something for another podcast perhaps. But anyway, you're right. Vespers, at least in its current incarnation, does begin with a hymn. Now, most of these hymns are not strictly biblical. They've been composed, so they're poetry. They follow a meter. And, of course, here at St Mary's, we either sing one of the Latin ancient office hymns or an English translation.
Right. Yes, I was about to ask, actually, about the language that Vespers is sung in, because some nights it's Latin and some nights English. Is that right?
That's right. We've chosen at the moment to alternate. There are a number of reasons for doing this. I think there are different virtues to praying the office in different languages. And at St Mary's in normal times, the choir would sing Vespers most nights in Latin. But at least 2 or 3 of the services are actually sung in English, often by a cantor in alternation with the congregation. So they're slightly different, and yet they really try to achieve the same thing, but I think that they do it in slightly different ways. The language, it isn't just about whether or not one can instantly understand the words. I think actually the 2 modes of prayer actually are slightly different and invite a different type of participation.
When you say modes of prayer, you mean in English versus in Latin?
That's right.
Right. That's an interesting idea. So after the hymn, though, comes what, Thomas?
The psalmody, and in many ways this is the meat in the sandwich for evening prayer. There are 3 psalms, or actually, strictly speaking, there are 2 sections from the book of Psalms, and then a canticle, another section from one of the New Testaments. But in any case, this section we call the psalmody, broken into 3, but each of the 3 psalms is bookended by an antiphon. And these antiphons, again, come back throughout the office and indeed the Mass. It's usually just 1 or 2 sentences set to music that will in some way encapsulate a particular theme or idea. And so as we move through the week, starting on Sunday, of course, through to Saturday, which is in fact the Vigil of Sunday, we get to hear different psalms every evening.
So it's almost like it's been arranged.
It's been very carefully arranged
throughout the year. And so three psalms, or effectively three psalms, after which is now let me just think about this properly, it's the short reading, isn't it?
That's right. And it really is short. It's not quite like the readings at Mass. It's a little snippet of Scripture. Again, all of this is designed to help focus one's prayer. And so it's very appropriate that we should have a reading from Scripture. But that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to keep the movement of the office flowing. So the reading then leads into what we call the short responsory. And I suppose the responsory is in itself a response to the reading. It's really one sentence sung by the cantor that's answered by another sentence sung by either the rest of the choir or the congregation. Then there's Glory be to the Father, and we have the initial sentence repeated.
And now I've noticed, I don't know if you want to dwell on this at the moment, but most of the time it feels like that we have the same music or tune for the short responsory from one day to the next. Is that...
That's right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not forget that that all of the music for the offices is designed to be a vehicle. It's designed to be useful. It's designed to make it possible for the prayer to be sung. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why we might want to sing prayer, and of course the entire office and the singing of it is something that's grown up over centuries. Particularly, it would have been developed in monasteries, in communities that were doing this 7 or 8 times every day. So, of course, it gets a certain workmanlike character, but that doesn't stop parts of it being extraordinarily beautiful. Anyway, the short responsory has what we call a tone. In fact, there are several of them. There's a different one, a slightly more ornate one for solemn feasts. But you're right, it's basically the same melodic idea that can just be arranged to fit different texts.
Yeah, it's clever like that, isn't it?
Indeed.
And then following the short responsory is... now, is it fair to say that what follows is the sort of high point of the Vespers?
Absolutely. So the two main offices, the most important ones, are morning prayer, or Lauds, and evening prayer, Vespers. And each of those main offices has a particular canticle that comes, perhaps you might say it's sort of at the golden section point of the office, but it's very definitely the climax. And for evening prayer, that canticle is the Magnificat, Mary's hymn of praise from Luke's Gospel. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord.
Of course, so that's a pretty important text, the Magnificat, because it's Our Lady saying yes to the Incarnation.
Yes, it's an extremely important text, and of course it's also a text that perhaps as much as any other really lends itself to being sung.
It has that sort of lyrical quality, hasn't it?
It does, and I suppose, look, that has to be said of most of the parts of Vespers. All these psalms, they're poetry that's intended to be sung. The Magnificat's really no exception. It is great, of course, if people come together to pray the office and to say these words, but I really believe, of course I would say this, but that it takes on a particularly special character when it's sung.
Yes, no doubt. What comes next, though?
Then after the Magnificat, which of course is preceded and followed by an antiphon, a Magnificat antiphon in this case, then we have some prayers, and they're in the standard enough intercession format, with a response that the congregation says, and we don't tend to sing those prayers at the cathedral, we just say them. Those prayers are followed by the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, and then all of the prayer of the office, if you like, is brought together by what we call a collect prayer, which does exactly that. It collects all the thoughts into one final prayer that the celebrant prays. We all say Amen. Then there's a brief conclusion to the office. Let us bless the Lord. Thanks be to God. And then at St Mary's we finish every Vespers service with one of the 4 hymns to Our Lady. Now actually these 4 hymns, it's normally Salve Regina, but during Advent it's Alma Redemptoris Mater. During Lent it's Ave Regina Caelorum, and at Easter time it's Regina Caeli. Now these Marian hymns or antiphons most properly belong to the end of a different service from the Divine Office. That's night prayer, the last prayer or the last service of the day, also called Compline. Now we don't have public services of Compline in St Mary's yet. So what we do instead is to just take that Marian antiphon and have it at the end of Vespers, because, well, it's a good thing to do for lots of reasons, but certainly in St Mary's Cathedral, dedicated to Our Lady Help of Christians, it's a very good way to end out the office and indeed the liturgical day.
Right, so that's how it all works. Let's circle back and look at how it all gets put together. But before that, Thomas, I actually have a question that's been playing on my mind a bit over the last few days, which is, well, as I understand it, most of what you sing at Vespers is classified as chant. But what makes something chant, and what makes a particular piece of chant Gregorian chant?
Gosh, what a good question. Well, really, any here's a fancy word, any cantillation. So that's basically any singing, of course, can be classified as chanting. But then you're right that the particular quality of most of the music that we sing at Vespers does seem a little bit different to, for want of a better term, more modern music.
Yeah, so, and modern in this case might mean from the 15th century.
Yes, indeed. What most of it doesn't have is a time signature. So right. Most music is organised into a particular rhythm, and that rhythm will be further organised into regular, what we call bars.
Yep.
Now, chant, liturgical chant, as I said before, it's very functional in nature. It's got a job, and that's actually to just to enliven, to bring the text to life for people, to add that extra dimension to the text as it's prayed. So we don't want to put too many sort of structures into that. We don't want to make it more difficult for people to pray, and not that rhythm necessarily does that, but chant by its nature it sounds very free.
Right, and is it in some ways perhaps more closely relatable and flexible with the texts that are being sung? Is that a fair way to put it?
I think so, because the amount of text is considerable. You could say it's quite wordy. So in adding notes to that, we're already adding one layer of complexity. If we were to add a rhythmic structure as well, then I suppose it gets a little bit more complicated again.
Yeah.
But that's not to say there is no rhythmic structure at all. So let's talk about the office hymns, for example. Now, I said that they're poetry, and indeed they are, and of course they have one of those elements that's common to a lot of poetry, metre. And by that I mean that each line of each verse, and the hymns are organised into verses, each line will have a regular number of syllables to make it fit. Now I've got here some of the various books that one would need to use in order to put together a service of Vespers. And when talking about the office hymns, it's useful to refer here to the Liber Hymnarius, or the Book of Hymns. And this actually does include all the hymns that one would need in order to sing, in fact, any of the offices. Now let's look for a particular one. I'm going to find one of my favourite hymns, Ave Maris Stella, which is sung for Feast of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So this gives us the tune as well as the words, but let's talk about the text first, because it's a regular text, as I said. So, Ave Maris Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix Celi Porta. That's verse 1.
Right.
So
Metrical, as you say. It's got a clearly defined meter of the syllables and the way it fits together.
That's right. So it's got 6 syllables for each of the 4 lines.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it needs a melody that's going to conform to that. And in this case, here's the melody. Now that happens to be one of the more complicated melodies, but I think that's also part of what makes it very beautiful.
Mm.
And that melody, of course, gets repeated for each verse because each verse has the same meter, so it's possible to do that. Now, we can simply come up with an English translation for these Latin words, but that's going to have the same meter if we want to use the same chant, the same melody. And sometimes that's easier to do, and sometimes it's not so easy to do.
Right.
It can depend a little bit on the text, and it can depend on whether or not a particularly poetically minded translator has set themselves that task. So we use a bit of a mixture of melodies that were designed for Latin texts but with English words that fit. And sometimes we use more modern metrical hymn tunes. So, in fact, for Feast of the Blessed Virgin, we don't use an anglicised version of that Ave Maris Stella melody. Instead, we use a more modern hymn tune called Abbott's Lee that goes like this. And there's the rhythm aspect that perhaps isn't really there in the chant. So there's the difference, if you like.
For me, that immediately brings to mind the words "Father, Lord of all creation." But what are the words in the translation of Ave Maris Stella?
So I can't remember all of them, but I know that it starts with "Sing we of the Blessed Mother," and it goes on. It is in fact a somewhat loose translation of Ave Maris Stella that wouldn't actually fit into the same melody we use for the Latin words.
Right, indeed. And as you say, I mean, some of this, I mean, very often these hymns have to be translated somewhat loosely in order for themselves to be metrical in English.
That's right, and of course the point is that just as you know different words that fit to that tune, that's the idea. That particular tune is often sung to other hymns like "Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken." I can think of others. So that's the point about it. But at least at what we're trying to do by having Vespers one night in Latin, one night in English, is to demonstrate the variety that's possible.
Yes, indeed. And so, I mean, it really is worthwhile then for people to keep watching, effectively.
Yes, I hope so. Some of the hymns are more simple than others. They're not all as complicated or indeed as beautiful as Ave Maris Stella.
But some simple hymns are also beautiful, surely.
I think so. Possibly beautiful in their simplicity. So the hymns on what we call ferial days are more simple than the hymns that you might have on a Sunday. For example, at an ordinary Vespers on a Monday, you might hear this hymn "Luminis fons lux et origo lucis," which has quite a simple tune. It's "Luminis fons lux et origo lucis, tu pius nostris precibus faveto, luxque peccati tenebris fugatis, nos tua donet." Now we can actually sing that particular hymn with an English translation. So in fact you will hear that sometimes sung in Vespers in the Cathedral.
Yeah, interesting. Do we know where some of these tunes actually come from?
I don't know exactly, except to say that some of them are very, very old indeed.
Right.
Others of them in the sort of grander scheme of Gregorian chant aren't that old. They might date from as late as the 15th century.
Interesting, right.
But yes, there's a bit of a variety there.
Good. Now, would you like to talk about the psalmody as well? And because, I think someone who does, come and listen to Vespers on several occasions might begin to think that, well, you basically sing the same tune over and over again for the psalm.
And that's exactly what we do, and we do it
right.
So that, again, let's think about those poor monks having to come and sing through these offices 7 or 8 times every day, including in the small hours of the morning when their brain really might not be on musical things. There does need to be a certain simplicity and utility about them. So for the Psalms, and I've got here, this is the English book of the Divine Office. So if I find a particular psalm, let's try and find a Vespers psalm. Here we are, evening prayer of Tuesday, week 3. So here's a good psalm. This is from Psalm 130. The text is, O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor haughty my eyes. I have not gone after things too great, nor marvels beyond me. Now, in order to decide what tune we're going to use, one of the several that can come back again and again and again, we need to look at that little piece of text that actually is specified before the psalm, the antiphon. And in this case, the antiphon reads, unless you become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I would need to go and find the antiphon, and that's actually not as easy as one might hope that it might be. But there are collections of antiphons. Some of these are actually medieval. They're really, really old collections. There are more modern ones that have been brought out in the last sort of 10 or 20 years, but they tend not to be very comprehensive. It's quite hard. You can't always find all the antiphons that you need, which is frustrating.
Yeah, that must be very frustrating, yeah. But so when you say that these collections have come out in the last 10 or 20 years, that we're still talking about antiphons with, ignoring the text, but the music of those antiphons that wouldn't necessarily have been written within the last 10 or 20 years, would it?
No, that's right. So what the Vatican authorities, the people that are putting together, and they're still doing it, all the chant for the offices decided some time ago, is that they wouldn't actually compose any more new Gregorian chant. So whereas some of these texts are new, they didn't, when I say new, they might not have been sung as part of the office before.
Right, yeah.
There's not always a piece of chant existing to go with them. And I have to say, I don't really understand why it's not possible to compose any more chant, even if it was to be in the style of Gregorian chant. I mean, all of the Gregorian chant was composed by somebody at some point. It isn't as though an angel sang it into Pope Gregory's ear one evening and he wrote it all down. That really isn't what happened. Anyway, leaving that aside...
So sorry, just to interrupt, but when did that policy come into effect?
I don't know exactly when that policy came into effect, but it was certainly the policy that was adopted after the Second Vatican Council, when it was necessary to fit music to the reformed liturgies. So Vespers from this book, The Divine Office, has been substantially reformed from how it was before the Council. There are lots of differences, but for example, there used to be 5 psalms sung every day, whereas now, as we said, there are 2 plus a canticle. But the way the psalms are organised has changed, the antiphons have changed. So the Vatican asked the great monastery of Salem, who have a history of being great chant scholars, to put together the new books of chant to fit the new office and indeed the Mass. However, that's a very difficult job for lots of reasons, and as I say, it's still coming out, it's still being done in sections. But if, as we do at St Mary's, you want to sing the office in English as well as Latin, well, there's no book. There's no book of chant. Nobody has done this. It doesn't exist. So our policy here is to adapt the chants, the melodies from the Latin office, which we do sing, of course, to adapt those to fit the English text. And that requires, well, it requires some familiarity with the English text that I'm fortunate to say my staff and I and our singers, I think we do have that familiarity because we sing the Latin chants every day. And it does take some years of going through all these cycles before you really are able to speak with an accent, for want of an analogy. So looking at this psalm that I picked out, Psalm 130, we'd find the antiphon, unless you become like little children. Now, I think that antiphon does exist in Latin. Let's say it used notes something like this. Well, that would be in what we call mode 8. And that tells us that we're going to use a particular melody for the verses of the psalm, which would be, O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor haughty my eyes. There's verse 1. I have not gone after things too great, nor marvels beyond me. There's verse 2. And so we go with that same tune that keeps coming back again and again. The very last verse, as we've already said, would be the glory be to the Father. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. And this is what makes it possible for choirs to sing so many different psalms, and indeed congregations to join in with these things every day.
So you mentioned that was mode 8. How many of these modes are there, did you say?
Well, it varies a little bit, but technically we tend to say there are 8 modes. There are a couple of variants. Gosh, that's a topical word, isn't it, at the moment? But we usually talk about 8 church modes.
Right, okay. And then what defines, what is a mode?
Well, a mode is just a scale. We're used to talking about scales in music. The major scale that all of us know is this.
Yep.
And that's just a way of organising all the notes that exist between the two notes of an octave into 8 different intervals. But we can do that because, in fact, between the two notes of an octave, there are actually 12 intervals possible, but we only need 8 to make a scale. So it's about deciding whether we're going to use a semitone or a tone. So in the major scale, it goes tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Now, a mode is just a different organisation of those tones and semitones. There'll still be 8 notes in the mode. Mode 1 is a particularly common mode used in lots of chants, and if we wanted to know the notes of mode 1, it's easily done by playing all the white notes on the piano from D to D. So here's mode 1. I'll play it quickly first. And now I'll just go through and explain the tones and semitones. So unlike the major scale, it's tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, tone. Now this mode may be familiar because, in fact, it's the mode that hymn tune Ave Maris Stella was written in.
I'll
just play that again.
Yeah.
And what's, I think, interesting about mode 1 is, to our ears, and remember we're used to hearing so much more modern music, it sounds like it can't decide if it's major or minor. It might start as though it sounds minor, but then it's got that major character. There are lots of melodies that use this mode because it's particularly attractive. I'm thinking of this one from Simon and Garfunkel. Or even... Is
that actually from Simon and Garfunkel? Surely it's a traditional song.
I'm sure it's a folk song, isn't it? Another famous folk song, of course, Greensleeves. Mode 1. Or a more modern hymn tune.
Now the green blade riseth.
Indeed. So we tend to use these modes all the time in church music. And it's not just music of the office, it's all the chants for Mass are also organised into one of these 8 modes.
So effectively, just to go back to first principles, that scale that you played previously for mode 1, that then defines the notes that can be used by tunes written in that mode. Have I understood that correctly?
That's right, and look, I don't think that in every case the people that composed all of the Gregorian chants necessarily set out, right, I'm going to write myself an antiphon now, and it's going to be absolutely strictly in mode 3.
Right.
It's a way that we classify chants, and look, in anything else, it's all to be done with good taste, and in the end, they're trying to write beautiful, prayerful music. Sometimes we don't think very much about Gregorian chant having been composed, but of course it has been. But broadly speaking, this is a way of classifying different chants.
A while ago, we were talking about the fact that these same tones keep coming up for the Psalms. I suppose that also kind of contributes to a meditative aspect to the prayer of Vespers.
Absolutely. I mean, I occasionally hear from visitors to the cathedral who might have walked in through the College Street door of an evening and hear the chant of Vespers wafting around the cathedral. At first they might wonder where it's coming from, because of course on a weekday we don't usually sing Vespers in the main sanctuary, but instead we celebrate that particular office in the side chapel of the Irish Saints.
Yeah, so the far side of the cathedral from where they walked in. Yeah,
that's right. So they can hear this extraordinary sound. There is a repetitive quality to it. It's quite almost hypnotic in its way, especially in the acoustic of the cathedral. And then they eventually discover it, and they're going to see not only it's not only hearing that repetitive quality, there's also some things to see. The fact that the singers stand at the end of every verse, they bow whilst they sing Glory be to the Father and to the Son, they stand up again, they sit down. There's all sorts of rhythms within the service that are discernible on different levels.
It's a spiritual exercise in so many ways, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. And look, It's possible to exercise spiritually virtually. I think that's one of the things that we've discovered about live streaming of Vespers. It's very different than live streaming Mass. I mean, it's great that people are able to participate in Mass from home, but it's a different kind of participation.
Yes, I suppose, without the Eucharistic aspect to Vespers, which of course requires an in-person participation to get the full, to get any grace from it whatsoever, really. Vespers doesn't involve any of that, and so you can participate that much more fully, can't you?
I think that's true, and the words come up on the screen, so hopefully that makes it easy for people to pray along as the chants are being sung and prayed in the cathedral.
Yeah, and is there something for the first time or second time viewer of Vespers, and so is there anything that you'd recommend for them to look out for in particular, Thomas?
I think probably the first time is just to try and I think there's a value in even listening to it with your eyes closed. Mm-hmm. Although we have some excellent people that operate the cameras in the cathedral, and they're always finding new and interesting ways of making the camera work assist the prayer.
Yeah.
I think the way in has got to be through the ears initially before it starts to become a visual thing.
Yeah.
And then, as I said before, there are different aspects to praying along, whether it happens to be sung in Latin or in English. Obviously, there's an immediacy for most of us in the English version. Most of us can understand the English words, whereas I certainly can't understand all the Latin words instantly. However, we hear a lot of spoken English in the course of a day. We're bombarded by it. And I don't know about you, but sometimes the more spoken words that I hear, or even sung words in English, I sort of tune some of them out, and that makes me kind of zone in and out.
I'm often saying, less English, please.
Well, whether we like it or not, that's just the reality of our lives, and I'm not sure that it is all that easy to really participate fully because it's so immediate. On the other hand, with Latin, because it's definitely not immediate, it takes time, and by that I mean you might be able to read the English text, but the thing doesn't move on until they've got to the end of the line. The singers have got to the end of the line.
No, indeed.
That forces us to actually to just ruminate on the words a little bit more.
Yes, it's a moment for a deep breath, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, indeed. So,
yeah.
Look, personally, one of the things that I sometimes do when I'm praying my rosary is to actually to pray that rosary in Latin. Because I find that, especially the repetitive nature of the rosary, I can be midway through my Hail Marys and either lose my place or realise that actually I've gone through 2 or 3 Hail Marys and haven't actually been thinking about anything that I should have been thinking about. My mind has wandered.
Yeah.
If I do it in Latin, and I can pray the rosary in Latin because, well, it's not that complicated once you know the prayers, and I do understand the words, but it's just enough of a layer of not even complexity. It's like a
differentiation,
prism,
perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I come to understand and appreciate the text that I'm praying through that prism, which just helps me focus, and I think opens up my prayer in a very different way that I'm very grateful for. So I would encourage people to try that, and they've got the opportunity to pray along one night in English and then the next night in Latin.
I think it's a very good opportunity for people to take advantage of, and I know that I, for one, am, especially in the current circumstances, I'm very grateful to you and to everyone at the Cathedral for making this possible. Do you think that it will continue after the present restrictions are lifted, Thomas?
Who knows? Who's got that crystal ball? And I mean, I find it difficult to even think about the present restrictions being lifted, although please God they will be.
Indeed.
But I tell you what certainly will continue is that we will continue singing for Mass and Vespers in this cathedral, and whether we live stream it or not, well, who knows?
Who knows, indeed. A little birdie told me that, in fact, I'm talking to one of the people that does some of the cathedral's camera work.
Out of necessity.
Right.
It's really not my forte, I have to say. So I apologise to any viewers that have seen some dodgy camera work for Mass or Vespers. I've only had to do it on occasion because several of our far more experienced and really very proficient camera operators are locked down. So there are several suburbs that people are not allowed to leave for work.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as that the number of those suburbs has grown, we've lost several camera operators. And as one of the last people standing, I've had to be taught how to do it. But isn't it interesting? I find conducting the choir or playing the organ at Mass just infinitely easier and less stressful than I do sitting in front of all those buttons and levers. It's really very difficult.
That's interesting because, I can use a computer and I can talk on the phone, but I absolutely hate online meetings.
Yeah.
Just because there's so much going on, because not only are people talking, you have to remember to unmute yourself unless you're one of those people who keeps yourself off mute the whole time, which is itself a poor form. But then there's the chat going on the side, and if you're hosting a meeting, you have to let people in, and it just absolutely. I find myself so overwhelmed by the whole experience. It can be quite exhausting.
I think, like you, I'm not one of the people that's going to be saying, "Oh, let's keep meeting by Zoom after we have to." I certainly look forward to that being consigned.
Well, I mean, I think probably what we should do is just cancel all meetings.
Or that.
Yeah, that's an option. And I also heard you recently on another podcast, you traitor.
Oh, I was very grateful and glad to have been asked to speak with Bishop Richard Umbers, Auxiliary Bishop of Sydney. And I think, you might say that Bishop Umbers is a unique voice in the Catholic social media world.
Yeah.
He creates memes, he does podcasts, he's got all sorts of ways of communicating with people, and he does so very, very effectively. Before he was a bishop, Bishop Umbers was also actively involved in teaching philosophy, I believe, and working with students. So he's got all sorts of gifts to offer, and his podcast is always a worthwhile listening experience. He's had some far more interesting and erudite guests than me. So it's really worth looking at the Episcopal podcast.
Yeah, the Episcopal podcast, which you can find on wherever you get your podcast, as they say. But Thomas's episode I enjoyed listening to. I mean, not least because there were... You and he are both Kiwis, Thomas, and so there was a certain shared bond there.
That's true. He was able to greet me in Maori, and I'm ashamed to say that I was not able to respond. I've been away too long.
I can only imagine the look on your face at that particular moment. Well, Thomas, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. People can see it's afternoon because I've got light shining in through the portion of the window that's not covered with curtains, and I know that you are interested in people's questions about...
Yes, I would love it if people have got any questions, particularly about the singing of Vespers from St Mary's, or about the live streaming, or what we're doing at the moment. Please write and ask these questions, and then we can answer them in a future podcast.
Yes, so if people want to get their questions in by, let's say, the 5th of September or so, 2021 is the year we're currently in, then we can perhaps be able to include those in our next episode, which will perforce be another remote episode and may well include video again.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's see if this one actually works properly.
Let's hope it
does. Yes.
Yeah, indeed. Now, what can people do if you have enjoyed this podcast? Please, first of all, make sure that you've subscribed to it in your podcast client. And I should mention, because I never do, that if you are looking for a podcast client and you are an iPhone user, then I personally would always recommend Overcast by Marco Arment. I recommend that because I actually use another piece of software that he's written to help in the production of the podcast, and so he offers that for free, but suggests that if possible people could promote Overcast. It's highly to be recommended and is very well regarded. So yes, subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or anywhere else. Ideally, a good review. If you've got a bad review, send it to us privately. And you can always get in touch with us by email, especially if you want to send us questions, as Thomas was just asking for, at stavedoff@cathedralchoir.sydney. And you can always find past episodes of the podcast on the Cathedral Choir website. You can also find the video for this episode if you want to go back and watch it on the Cathedral Choir website. That's at cathedralchoir.sydney/podcast. So until next time, Thomas, goodbye.
Nice to see you. Bye.